Welcome to Season 3 of This Is Your Life in Silicon Valley, a podcast about the Bay Area, technology, and culture. I'm your host, Sunil Rajaraman, and I'm joined by my co-host, Yasha Kakis-Wolf.
Hey, Sunil, what's happening today, man? How you doing?
Another day in pandemic life. All good, all things considered.
This is not about our guest, but I believe that I saw on Instagram that you finally got a Peloton in. Are you like up on number one in the classes already?
You know, I haven't yet taken my first class. It's sitting there, but I have high ambitions and I've become a quarantine cliche.
That's funny. Well, maybe you should do some live streaming of yourself when you do your first class. I might tune in.
No chance.
You know, this is not related to Peloton, obviously, or you during quarantine, but I've been thinking about a lot of the conversations we've had with the guests that have been on the podcast. A lot of them have come to the Bay Area because of college, because of university. Is that a thing that is a topic that we should be talking about more regularly? Like people come to the Bay Area just because of Stanford, just because of Berkeley?
It almost feels like we should be having that conversation in reverse, given what's happening to higher education right now. But yeah, this entire topic is pretty worth exploring.
Well, apropos of nothing, we have an awesome guest on today, Charles Hudson, who's a managing partner at Precursor Ventures today, who, like the question that I asked you, came to the Bay Area because of school.
He is, kind of a Silicon Valley pioneer in many ways. He was part of a venture fund called Soft Tech, which is one of the first seed stage funds here in the Valley. It's now called Uncork, but he has a fund called Precursor Ventures and is investing in entrepreneurs at the earliest stage of their careers.
And Charles has been an operator. He's kind of deeply intertwined into the founder community here in the Bay Area. He's a Black investor. And our conversation today kind of ranges all of those topics.
I really enjoyed the part about media, but you're really going to enjoy today's discussion.
Charles, we're super excited to have you on the podcast today. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Hey, I'm curious. I've seen your name around in the Bay Area for a while, but I don't know if you are a Bay Area native. Are you from here?
It feels like it, but I was actually born in Michigan. So I came to Northern California in 1996. And other than a brief stint living in Japan for work, I've basically been here ever since.
As a young kid growing up in Michigan, was there ever a point in time where you're like, I am going to San Francisco?
Never. Before I came here, the only time I'd been to California was my cousin was in the Marines. And I went to San Diego for his graduation. And I'll never forget the first day I came to Northern California as a Michigander. I'm like, oh, California is warm. So I showed up in the Bay Area with a bag full of shorts and T-shirts. And you can imagine how that went, even in May.
Well, you bought one of the sweatshirts that say San Francisco on them, right?
Absolutely.
Everybody has that story. Well, so that's fascinating. So you had one experience coming into California, starting down in Southern California, which has got all of its attributes that some people like and some people don't. And then you come up to the San Francisco Bay Area and then you leave. And then what happens? Do you go off to college? Do you choose to work in an industry? Like what brings you to San Francisco?
I came here for Stanford undergrad and I came and visited. And of all the schools I visited, it's the place that I felt most comfortable and most at home. And I really liked it. And at various times I've thought about leaving. So after graduation, I almost moved to New York to do the investment banking thing like many Stanford undergrads. And I ended up staying here to work for InQtel, the CIA's venture capital group. And that was a lot of fun. At one point in time, I thought about going back east to work in venture capital in sort of the Boston area, but decided instead to stay and do business school here at Stanford. And at various other times, I've had professional or personal opportunities to move, but I really like it here. And I don't really have any desire to leave.
Did I hear that right?
Charles,
Sunil,
we're doing that.
We're going to talk over each other.
That's the tip jar.
Yeah, you see, the tip jar. I like this. Before you jump in, Sunil, I heard CIA and investments. Is that right? Like the government CIA. You worked for the government. You lived in San Francisco and you made investments on their behalf?
People always ask me, like, tell me something that you think happens in the Bay Area that doesn't happen in other places. And it's hard for me to think of good examples, except for how I got my first job in venture. So I worked at, and you all are of the age that this company will probably resonate for you. I was an intern at Excite at Home in late 99, early 2000. And one of my mentors and managers there, her husband ran InQtel, the CIA's venture capital group. And as my internship was wrapping up, I went to her and said, "Hey, I think I'm going to take this finance opportunity in New York. I'm really excited." She said, "Hey, before you do that, you should go talk to my husband because he started this venture capital firm and he could really use some help." I knew almost nothing about venture capital at the time. I just knew I trusted her judgment on people. And if she said I should meet her husband and hear what he's doing, I was going to hear him out. And that's how I ended up becoming a venture capitalist for the first time.
Now we'll just wait for the quiet spot.
Charles, so we did the thing where I was being too polite and I waited too long for Yasha to interrupt me, but we're good now. I don't think it's going to happen again. So, little known fact, I don't know if Charles remembers this, but I have pitched him.
Yes.
Did you know that, Yasha?
God, seriously? I had no idea. How small is this place?
I sat in a boardroom. I'll never forget this. It was at kind of AOL headquarters. Like, strangely, I think you had an office there when you were part of SoftTech, Charles. And I remember sitting in a room with you. Now, the way that ends is they did not invest, sadly. But we did, as a consolation prize, get him on the podcast, I guess, 5 years later. That's pretty good, right?
Yeah, I remember that meeting. And ironically, some of your coworkers from that startup ended up working at other startups in my portfolio later in life.
It's all a circle of life in Silicon Valley. It's all just the circle of life. Charles, it's hard to have a conversation right now about Silicon Valley without the raging Twitter war between technology and media. And Yasha and I like to think of ourselves as neutral parties in this because we're not journalists. We just kind of have a podcast that we do for fun. We're obviously lifelong tech people. Weigh in on it for me. What's your take on what's going on? Why is this happening? And how will it ultimately end, in your opinion?
I don't know how it ultimately ends. I can tell you what my perspective is on this whole topic. It seems to me that for most of tech's life, I think two things were true. Most people didn't care that much about technology because it didn't impact their everyday life. So tech was like its own beat that didn't bleed over into society, politics, and culture. And I think for a long time, most people in tech, maybe with some exceptions about technology that touches defense or weapons or things like that, I think most people said, like, the impact that technology companies have on society is unambiguously good. I think the last 5 years have really changed, maybe the last 10 years have changed both of those dynamics. Now, technology is a part of everyone's life. Everyone has a smartphone. Everyone interacts with technology. Your job and the way you work is being shaped by the products that technology companies are building. So I feel like tech went away from being this kind of niche single beat to something that's a part of every story. And I think that means technology is getting scrutiny and review from people who are not from the industry. I think it's for any industry, when you get covered by the people that know your beat, there is a tendency to become somewhat sympathetic to the plight of the people in the industry, and you understand the nuances and ins and outs. And I think what we have now is we have some people with fresh eyes looking at technology and saying, wait a minute, like, what are the implications for automation on jobs? And what are the implications for things like the gig economy on, worker pay? There's all of these questions that are being asked, I'd say, from a more adversarial point of view, or maybe more skeptical. Maybe adversarial is too strong a word. A more skeptical view that these things are unambiguously good. And I think as some tech companies have become large enough to be nation states of their own, and they've become principal ways that people consume information, it's called into question the role that they play in society, and the decisions they make around whose voices get heard and how have much larger implications outside of the tech sphere. And I feel like all industries go through this adolescence and relevance phase. And I feel like sometimes in technology, we want to have it both ways. We want to be like revered and loved and not criticized and seen as like universally good, but we also want coverage. And I
think that's a great, I think that's a great assessment. And just the follow-on question to that would be, I have been pretty disturbed by the extremity of behavior we've seen just as it relates to this debate. It feels like a lot of people are overreacting, and Twitter is just turning into a cesspool of just angry individuals. Why haven't we seen more, I don't know, leadership, it feels like, with regard to this debate? It feels like, people should step in either on the tech side or the journalist side, I don't know, and just say, like, look, let's just all be mature adults about this and figure it out. Why is there such a void in leadership? And, is anyone going to step up and just say, hey, you know what? Let's be a rational voice here, and it's okay for tech to get scrutinized. It's okay for journalists to do their job, and everybody plays a vital role. Like, what's going on there? Lack of leadership.
I think we're talking about two audiences who don't understand each other. I have friends who are journalists who are like, we criticize lots of companies. Like, we're not singling out tech companies for criticism. Like, part of the role of journalism is to ask tough questions and to be critical in the same way that political journalists are critical about the decisions that politicians make. And whether you like it or not, celebrity journalists are critical of the decisions that celebrities make. I just think tech's not accustomed to criticism. And I think part of why you see such a backlash is I think most people in tech are like, well, my intention with this product I built was noble and good. And I think what some of the journalists are saying, well, I understand your intention. Let me tell you about how your intention or your desires are playing out in the real world. And this is a very new conversation for tech, to like be confronted with a gap between maybe an entrepreneur's aspiration and the actual real world impact of a product or service that they've built. So the criticism is new. I also think tech Twitter, and I'm part of it, is a tribal club. And I think if you're part of that tribe, attacks on prominent members of the tribe can feel like an attack on all. And I think part of what you're seeing is this sort of, how dare you criticize this person? This person is one of us, and it's not okay to say bad things about that person or that type of person. And so I think you have in media an industry that's accustomed to being critical or skeptical of the claims that people make and doing what I think they think of as their normal job, and an industry that's like adjusting to more scrutiny, but where the people are highly networked and find common cause. And I don't know how this ends. Like, some of the people on both sides, both the journalists and the people in the tech industry that are fighting, they have massive audiences, followings, and platforms. They work at huge venture capital funds. They have tens of thousands, or in some cases, maybe millions of followers. And then you have journalists at publications that are some of the largest in the world. I think eventually we'll figure out how to respect each other's roles, but I don't think that's going to happen quickly. I don't think either side feels like they want to cave.
I think that the tribal angle is really smart, Charles. That point of view really resonates with me. Like, when somebody goes after, for right or for wrong, someone who I feel like is associated with my ideals or maybe in my friend circles, like, I'm going to get upset as well. So I think that's a really interesting way to look at it. So thank you for sharing that. I'm really curious, how many portfolio companies do you have right now? Is it more than a dozen? Like, it's a lot, right?
Oh boy. We normally don't disclose, but I'll tell you, we have 202.
Okay. So that's a good number.
That includes, but that's historical investment since the beginning of Precursor. That includes companies that have sold, shut down. That's sure. Like cumulative companies we've invested in since day one.
Got it. Awesome. So here's the context for that. It all related to this discussion. You get maybe a couple hundred companies and founders and executives at those companies that are kind of watching what's happening in this tribal battle. It's maybe only taking place on Twitter, but it's still happening. What are you telling the companies and the executives in your portfolios right now? Or what advice would you give them if they asked you about how to navigate through exactly what they're seeing happening?
I think the advice I've given some of them is generally like, is this really your fight? Do you feel directly impacted by this conversation that's happening between these two camps of people? Is this something you really want to or need to weigh in on? And a lot of them have said, well, probably not. What I will say, though, is for a lot of them, I said, you've got to understand we live in a world now where if you go to approach a journalist for coverage of your startup and your launch plans, you have to go in understanding that they're not an extension of your PR team.
Yeah.
There's a chance you will talk to them, and the reaction that they will have to your company, its product, and some of its decisions will be skeptical, and they might write about it. And I think there was a period of time where people felt like, well, the journalists and the press is sort of an extension of our PR and marketing team. And like, they're either going to write nice things about us or they're not going to write at all. And I don't think that's healthy. I think there are lots of things that startups and small companies do that are worthy of criticism. And I've told a bunch of our portfolio companies, like, this is the world we live in. There's a chance that they will hear your labor-saving innovation, and they're going to think about the workers who are impacted by the nature of the product that you're creating, and they're going to choose to write about that. You know, your epic battle with the San Francisco city government to, you know, win the right to use your service might be reinterpreted as yet another startup that's, you know, trampling on well-established laws to make a buck. You just have to understand that the world's a little different and go into those conversations with eyes wide open.
I want to shift gears just for a second away from this media tech debate into, you know, it really felt like, I want to say, it was about 6 weeks ago where we as a country had a moment where we recognized issues around racial inequality, systemic racism, and, you know, a lot of people coalesced around this movement, and it felt like, you know, it felt invigorating in ways. Do you think that, you know, we've sustained that momentum, Charles? And have we, you know, was that really a moment, or in your opinion, was that a temporary moment in time?
I think it's a moment. I don't know what comes next. And here's why I think it's a moment. If I think about the evolution of my experience as a Black person in tech, I've only worked in tech and venture capital the whole time I've been here. That's like all I know. So I can't talk about other industries. When I first got here, if I think about the evolution, first people said, well, tech doesn't have any of society's problems. We're not racist. We're not sexist. This is all about ideas. It's a meritocracy. That lasted for a very long time. And then people said, okay, well, maybe we're not as fair as we think we are. You know, there's not a lot of women. There's not a lot of people of color getting through the system. Maybe it's not just about the ideas. So let's do the first easy thing, which is let's include women and people of color, frankly, like me, who are sort of like 1 degree adjacent. They went to the schools we went to. They, you know, worked at companies where we've worked. Like, they're known. And I think what surprised some of these folks is when they started asking us, what's your experience has been like? It's not that like, oh, like we've had no challenges whatsoever. And so to me, the big question is, if you look at a lot of venture firms, they don't have any Black people on their investing team, and they might not have any Black founders in their entire portfolio. I mean, I've talked to some general partners privately who've told me like they don't remember the last time they had a Black founder pitch at the all partner meeting. And so the thing that I am happy about is I think for a long time, Black and brown people have been saying, guys, these are not isolated events. If there's someone who's a victim of police brutality who loses their life in a different city in America every week, that's a pattern. That's not a bunch of isolated incidents. And it felt very frustrating because there was no space for that conversation. And it's almost like overnight, everyone said, wow, we see the pattern. I think the challenging thing for tech is going to be, how does tech and venture make itself an industry that's hospitable for people of color? And I've told a bunch of firms, I'm like, you know, to really make a difference, you're going to have to hire different people to work on your investment team. And you're going to have an investment process where Black and brown people get to the finish line. And anything short of that, to me, is concerning. And so I've been, you know, really pushing people to say, if you don't have Black and brown founders showing up at the finish line of your of your funnel. And look, venture capital financing goes to a very small chunk of companies, but if they're not showing up at the finish line, rather than create a parallel process or an on-ramp, figure out what it is about your core funnel that doesn't work. Most of us in venture can't even...
I actually just kind of want to dig into that a little bit.
Yeah.
How much of this do you think is driven by... So, there's the venture side of it, there's the founder side of it. How much of it do you think it's driven by sort of the archetype of the founder that Silicon Valley is sort of romanticized, right? So you have Zuckerberg, you have, Travis from Uber, you have, Elon. And so it's generally this sort of maverick white guy, who's going against some force. And is it really possible to change without creating a new archetype? And follow-on question to that is, who is the archetype, right? Who does it have to shift to? Is there a person or a company that sort of embodies this new archetype?
I'd argue Toby from Shopify is a pretty different person in that regard, in terms of like personality profile, self-presentation. I'd say Shopify has been a pretty good venture investment. I think there's this myth that you have to be this like cunning, cutting edge, hyper alpha person to be a successful founder. What I'd argue is it's actually the reverse. If that's kind of what you think works and you over index on that, you will get people that are successful with that profile. The bigger question is like, well, what are you missing out on by saying like, this is the rigid profile? I think the bigger issue is most venture sourcing is still kind of happens in closed proprietary networks. And if you look at those networks, whether it's like my alma mater, Stanford, or Harvard, or whatever the top 10 rated institutions are, they're not particularly racially diverse. If you look at the tech companies where investors are comfortable sourcing talent, those companies aren't particularly diverse. And so if you just say like, hey, we're going to like stick with our sourcing strategy of like public tech companies in the Bay Area, plus startups we know, plus engineers and product managers from a handful of private companies that we like or schools that we know, no matter how hard you work that channel, it's only going to produce so many Black and brown people, period. So the real challenge for the industry is like, are you willing to revisit not just the archetype of what a founder looks like, but where founders come from?
I buy that. I think that there's an acknowledgement inside of organizations that you've got to be mindful of kind of where you're looking to grow your businesses. And when you're thinking about places that have geo-distributions or different networks, you can actually be a lot more smart about building an organization that represents the world that you work in and that you're building products for. I wanted to, so thank you for sharing that. I wanted to shift gears a little bit, same broad topic. There was some meetings that happened over the course of the last few days that the Washington Post wrote about and USA Today, like a bunch of different, with Facebook in particular. So a bunch of civil rights leaders got together with some of the executives at Facebook to talk about some of the systemic issues that they believe exist on their platform. And they're big drivers for the ad boycott that's taking place right now. I'm kind of curious how you see that playing out. Like, are we going to see change coming because advertisers are pulling out of Facebook? Is there an acknowledgement that some of the topics that we're just talking about now has a relationship into Facebook's platform? But kind of broadly speaking, what do you think is going to happen with Facebook over the course of the next several months with all that's happening right now?
I think this is a fascinating question. And I don't know that I have a clear answer. What I do think is I think what the civil rights organizations are asking for, to me, seems eminently reasonable, which is like, hey, find a better way to police hate speech and some of these like things that are obviously not true and destructive, that are potentially indoctrinating people with harmful and dangerous beliefs. Do more to stop this from happening. And everything I've read from their point of view about how that meeting went, I think a couple of the articles I read used the word appeasement, which I think people only use that word very intentionally, which the takeaway I got was that Facebook, from the point of view of these organizations, does not seem to be serious in addressing this. And more importantly, I think has a fundamentally different view of its role in this conversation than those organizations do. And there's only one of two states of the world I can kind of easily imagine One is that the leadership at that company holds fast on their current view of their role in society and their role when it comes to dealing with this type of content. And they just take the short-term pressure that's going to come from ad boycotts and maybe bet cynically that companies can't afford to not advertise on Facebook for very long and that they'll come back. Or they evolve their thinking and say, maybe we should revisit our views on this topic. Like, I was pleasantly surprised to see Twitter start to take, as a counterpoint, to take some actions on some of these things. Like, all these companies could, I think, be doing a lot more.
Yeah.
But again, I think this goes back to this thing we talked about earlier, which is I think many of these people couldn't envision a world in which their creations were being used in ways that they didn't intend and that are harmful for society. And at some point, when like the way people are using a product is different than the way that you had intended, I don't know, I would feel responsibility for fixing that if it were my product. I'm not Mark Zuckerberg, so I can't really tell him what to do. I just know personally, I would feel a tremendous amount of responsibility if something I had built was being used in that way.
Yeah, I totally and completely agree with you. I think we see that playing out with, the apps du jour, be it Clubhouse or Parler. Like, at the end of the day, if you're the founder, you've created something, people are getting value from it, and then something happens that you don't expect and is bad. You got to take the feedback and make a decision if you're going to change or not. And if you make a decision to not change, then I think that says something. And I think probably it says something that should have consumers choose to not use those products in the same way. Maybe that's an evocative statement.
So I have to interject, and I have to ask Charles about this, since you brought up Yasha Clubhouse, our favorite subject to text back and forth on. And disclosure here is I am a Clubhouse member. And, I've been trying to get Yasha in, but, to no avail. I guess they just don't, I don't know, they don't want to give him an invite. You're supposed to look. But look, I'm fascinated by kind of, Charles, I would be curious to know just your perception on social networks. And so, and where they logically end. And so Twitter is kind of turned into this, depending on who you follow, the experience varies. Facebook, we have alleged, Russian interference here and there and just all sorts of other stuff going on. And then, Clubhouse, what the experience like there for me was as a new, person, I joined 6 weeks ago. I really like what Paul and Rohan are building. I think it has a lot of potential, but it quickly kind of got to this place where we're having a heated debate and recording on the platform. I guess my question is just, is all social media is it inevitable that it turns into a hate machine, or is there an outcome where it doesn't?
Wow. That's such a big question. I too am a Clubhouse member, and I enjoy the product. And I think it's really different than anything else I've used. When it comes to sort of like what's the end game, I think almost all ad-supported social media products end up in this conundrum, which is in order to make the ad-supported model work, you need a large audience. In order to build a large audience, you have to focus on growth. And things that limit growth, like content moderation or having rules about what one can and cannot discuss or say, or friction, tend to impact growth in a negative way. And so I think some of the problems we have in social media are maybe the belief that once we get to scale, we'll deal with this then. Or it's only a couple of trolls, and so like we can live with it. It's basically fine. I think what I've learned is that the people who want to harass people and make their lives miserable have a lot of time on their hands and are willing to chase people across platforms. So my general view is I haven't seen many companies early in their life say, you know what, we're not going to put up with this. Like, we don't want this on our platform. Maybe I would say the counterexample is I think Discord has done a pretty good job by all accounts of being kind of unambiguous at various times. Like, hey, Discord is not a place for this type of activity. You want to organize for this or use this? Like, we're not the infrastructure to enable you all to congregate. And I don't know all of the details well enough. But my sense is like they've decided that there's certain stuff that's just not going to happen on Discord, and they've been able to grow just fine. But I think if you start a social media company with a belief that like content moderation policies and rules like that are going to create friction and slow you down, I think you're less likely to care about or enforce those things. And then you end up with a platform where it's rampant, and those people maybe rightly feel like, well, hey, you've let us be here all along. What gives?
This leads me to my next question before we ask sort of wrap up questions, which is just another big one, but you're really articulate and you're able to synthesize these complicated subjects into very, very good, sound bites for our listeners. It's around free speech, right? And so we have to have this chat for just a minute. I mean, where are you on this whole, free speech, absolutism spectrum? And, it's right now, it's the topic of the moment. And I'm just curious where you stand and where you think tech's role is in regulating speech.
I generally am pro free speech. I'm not an absolutist by any stretch. I think when I look at the current tech debate, I think there's two different conversations that are happening, and I'll characterize them this way. There's the like, well, you're just not allowed to say this on social media anymore, so that's not fun. My speech is being restricted. There's like that bucket, which I think is different. Then there's the like things I think we could generally agree are threatening, hateful, scary, incitements to violence, maybe even, and are the standards around who's allowed to say that stuff and have it remain up, are they applied consistently and fairly? So let's start with the first one, which is the like, you can't say this on social media. I think it's kind of a BS argument. You can say whatever you want, but if you say something stupid or offensive, people are going to tell you, and you might feel like you're getting attacked for saying something that like sounds innocuous to you, or when you say it, you don't understand how it's going to land for people. And I think pre-social media, there was no feedback loop for people, especially if you're powerful. So if you were powerful and you said something that people didn't agree with or like, you didn't have to listen. And in fact, they probably had no channel to express their displeasure or frustration or tell you to think about this a different way. And I think for people in power, this is a new thing, which is like, if you're going to say it on some of these public social media platforms, the nature of those platforms is that the people that feel aggrieved are going to feel entitled and very able to tell you why they think what you said was dumb, silly, or stupid. So this notion you can't say it for most people, I think, is simply untrue. You might not want to deal with the consequences. You might not want to have your replies blown up with a bunch of people who disagree with you. But I think there's very few things that I see, at least in tech and business Twitter, that one cannot say if you're prepared to deal with the backlash. I think
they say there's absolute freedom of speech. There's just not always freedom after speech.
Yeah. And I think if you want to say, I have people whose political views and personal views are very different than my own, and they share those views on Twitter, and sometimes they get constructive criticism and they don't like it. And I don't know what to say other than say, when you express your views publicly, you are opening yourself up to that, given the way these networks work today. I think, by the way, this is particularly true of VC Twitter. And I've said things before. People have said, hey, that's really not a very informed comment. And I'm like, well, thank you for letting me know. Because powerful people, I think, are just not used to that kind of accountability. I think that's fine, that people should just understand that's the way that the world works now. I have a much harder time with this notion that we should allow people who are trying to organize hate speech, who are trying to brigade people offline. Like, I don't understand why we have to have such a laissez-faire attitude toward these things, because what you're really doing is you're pushing all of the costs of dealing with this stuff down to the victim. And I think you have to remember that, like, social media makes it really easy for mobs to organize and for those people to go after people, powerful or powerless. And I think for some of these platforms to say, well, we had no idea that this like activity or this organization or this group or this list, we had no idea, or this thread or Reddit, we had no idea what they were up to. I'm like, come on, guys, really? It's a choice. It's a choice that you're going to allow that stuff to be up rather than to take a position and say, our platform is not for this. Like, I was quite surprised that Reddit did what they did with the Donald.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that would like, probably never happen for fear of like angering the audience of people for whom that's their home.
Yeah. Charles, I want to set you up for our final question. And then I want to ask you two really quick questions before that. The final question is related to the social networks that you spend your time. So maybe we can pick Twitter or LinkedIn or anywhere else that you spend your time. That question is, whom would you recommend to our listeners to follow on this network? So think about that question for a second. But I've got two relatively quick questions. The first one is related to the U.S. election coming up in November. So who wins in November?
I have no idea who wins in November. If you had told me we could have a global pandemic, mass unemployment, lockdowns where we're not sure that schools are going to reopen in the fall, the greatest civil rights protests we've had in 50 years, and the incumbent is still actively in the conversation for potentially winning, I think that says a lot about where we are.
Yeah. All right, here's my follow-on for you. I appreciate that answer very much. In spite of me wanting you just to say definitively, I know who's going to win. Second question is, you've lived in the Bay Area for a while now, and you kind of work in the space that you do, and we've been having this conversation about lots of different topics. On the spectrum of being a pessimist or an optimist over the next 5 years, like, where do you find yourself?
I'm a huge optimist, which can feel really hard given the current state of our city with the people that are unhoused and some of the challenges we have in general with just the infrastructure. Mm-hmm. I guess I'm an optimist because I feel like we're getting to the breaking point in San Francisco with so many things around housing, transit, quality of life. This is like, if you zoom out, it's a beautiful place to live. Like, we have everything. We have wine country. We have Big Sur. We have the San Francisco Bay. We have great weather. This is like too beautiful of a place for us to screw it up. But clearly we've done a pretty good job of backing ourselves into a really tough corner. And I think we're approaching a breaking point where some things, particularly I think around housing policy and the way that we allocate land, they're going to have to come back on the table if this San Francisco experiment is going to continue to work. And maybe, like many things in America, you have to get pushed to the brink before you can really make change. And one of the things that I'm hopeful for coming out of COVID and as we start to rebuild the economy is that things that were difficult to touch and deal with before get back on the table. And I think a lot of that's like how we use our streets, how we allocate land, how we think about housing. I really hope that we take advantage of this opportunity to rethink some of these things.
Yeah, I appreciate that. It's been awesome having you on today. I want to end off our discussion with our final question, which is on the networks that you spend your time. Who are recommended follows to the listeners of this podcast?
Man, it's always so difficult. I feel like I'm going to inadvertently snub people. I would say, I tend to, a long time ago, Chris Dixon had a tweet back when he tweeted a lot about like Twitter is more fun if you're positive, is something to that degree. I would say Lolita Taub is one of my favorite people to follow on Twitter because she's doing a lot of cool work, I think, to bring new people into the venture ecosystem. And the majority of the content she puts out is positive. And it's not always easy to be a positive advocate for change in tech.
Yeah.
And I really enjoy sort of seeing her thrive and succeed on Twitter. It's a lot of fun. The other person I would highly recommend, because he is one of the funniest people I know, is Reggie James from Eternal. And disclosure, I'm an investor in his company, but I would be an avid follower of his Twitter and Substack, even if I were not. I'm in my 40s, and like the energy I get from him as someone who's much younger than me going through the world, it's energizing.
Hey, speaking as another 40-year-old person plus, I certainly agree with you. You got to have those people who give you a little bit of a fresher kind of pop of energy in your life for sure. Hey, Charles, we really appreciate you being on with us today. Thank you so much for having such a thoughtful conversation.
This was awesome.
Thanks
awesome for having me, guys.
Thanks, Charles.
Thank you.
So Neil, I'm curious, after having that conversation with Charles, how do you think about social media? Do you think it kind of maintains the momentum that is being created around it well off into the future?
Well, I mean, I think the point Charles was making around, we talked about Clubhouse a bit, is a really, really interesting point, and just in social networks in general, which is, the networks that, underinvest in moderation tools are naturally sort of hated, toward the end and thought of as sort of these negative places to be. But if they invest upfront too much in moderation tools, then how do they grow fast enough to build critical mass? And it's a fascinating question that I really enjoyed exploring with them.
Yeah, I appreciated today's conversation quite a bit. Super wide ranging and really engaging. Charles is just a really wonderful person.
Yeah, we hope you enjoyed today's episode. And as always, if you enjoyed this as much as I'm reversing the lines today, as much as I enjoy recording with Yasha, please rate us 5 stars on whatever podcast platform you're listening on. We really, really appreciate you supporting the show, especially during these strange times.
Thanks for listening to This Is Your Life in Silicon Valley. If you enjoyed listening to this podcast as much as Sunil and I enjoyed recording it, please go back to the application you found this podcast on, rank us 5 stars, leave us a comment. We read every single one. Thanks for listening to This Is Your Life in Silicon Valley.